out. I don't need any instructions. But then as we do when we get instructions for a toy, we think, well, I don't need the instructions. I'll just put it together. And then when things mess up, we go back to the instruction manual and we find out how it's done. And so that's what we do sometimes. We think we can handle the marriage relationship all by ourselves. But we need to read and reread the manufacturer's instructions. Because most of the problems we get in marriage can be traced to our ignoring the reading and the obeying of God's instructions. Early in Genesis, we find God's design for the marriage relationship. In Genesis chapter 2, verses 18 through 25. This text describes the original basis. And so what we find here is the basis for almost everything else the Bible says about marriage, especially in the Gospels in the New Testament. It explains God's reasons for designing marriage, and it also gives us many principles. When they're applied, they will enable us to build marriages that honor God and bring lasting joy to us. So I want to show you, I think it's 4 points this morning, and this thing is not working again. I'm just going to have to break down and buy one. Okay, we just tap the space bar. But anyway, we find, first of all, that God planned a bride in Genesis 2, verses 18 through 20. That there was one deficiency that remained in the Garden of Eden. I know Brother Willis last week talked about, and he did a masterful job of talking about God being in creation and how we need to just accept what God says and not listen to man. But there was one deficiency in the very beginning. I mean, there was, in the creation that Brother Willis talked about last week, there was adequate water. There was a beautiful and bountiful provision in the garden, and he put man there to cultivate all of that. But the problem now is there's not a companion suitable for man. That the garden, with all its pleasures and provisions for food and meaningful activity, was not sufficient unless these delights could be shared. And by the way, when I use that word deficient, that wasn't by accident. That was something God designed in order that man might come to an understanding of his need of woman. Adam was placed in the world none of us has ever experienced. It was a world without sin, but it was a world of beauty and perfection. And there was something, though, that was still lacking. In all of creation, one thing God said was not good. He said, it is not good for the man to be alone. And so this statement indicates that it was never God's intention for man to be alone. That from the very beginning, he intended to make two sexes in making man so that he could overcome the problem of loneliness. The answer to man's loneliness is found in the second part of verse 18. I will make a helper suitable for him. I think sometimes men picture a wife that, she vacuums the house and she makes the beds and she prepares the meals and she does the housework while the husband sits on the couch in the recliner or on the couch with a remote control in his hand, flipping from one station to another. But that is not what the word helper means in the Old Testament. Woman was to be a helper, not a slave and not inferior. In fact, the word for helper is azer, and it was a word that Moses obviously liked because he gave that name to one of his sons, Eliezer, as we see there in Exodus 18 and verse 4. And that Hebrew word there means Eliezer. It means my God is help. And when you go in Deuteronomy chapter 33 and in 3 different verses there, you see in the red there I have the word help. And so it refers to God as a helper. And sometimes it had the idea of military reinforcements. And so here's a little army, and it's outnumbered 5-1, and you're about to be destroyed. And then all of a sudden, here comes the military reinforcements. When I was growing up, I watched Gene Autry and Red Ryder and all of those. I get up at 7 o'clock on Saturday morning to watch them. And when they got in a tough spot, then the cavalry appeared, and everything was going to be okay. Several times God uses this word for himself. And it's as if he's saying, you were about to be wiped out, Israelite army, but I came in and I smote everyone with blindness, and you would have been destroyed without the word here is help, azer. And so the point of the word is that the help implies no inferiority whatsoever in Genesis chapter 2 in verse 18. Rather, it means that God is helping man by giving him a helper, by giving him woman. So the woman brings into man's life strength and reinforcements to meet the battles of life. And so she was to be a helper or a partner. And it said suitable or comparable or a counterpart to man. The Hebrew word for suitable is kenegdo, and it literally means according to the opposite. And so she would be like man in terms of humanity, but at the same time she would be totally unlike him, physically, emotionally, and socially. And we're confronting that right now, aren't we, in the social media and people that surround us with this transgender thing, that they want to go completely against what God has said in the very beginning of time. You know the story that God took a rib of Adam's, and out of that he built Eve, so they are of the same genetic makeup. She is every bit as human as he is. But I want you to see here that he did not create another man. Instead, Eve corresponded to him on every level. She complemented, and I don't mean the word complement, but I mean complemented where it means to complete or bring to perfection. She complemented him at every point. The woman is, in the very beginning of time, before she appeared on the scene, she's the missing part of man. Just as a jigsaw puzzle is incomplete if half the puzzle is missing, so a man is incomplete without his wife. But that doesn't mean that she's the same as man. She is different. So some men sometimes complain that the wife is different than men. Well, thank God for that. You ought to be glad she's different than you are. That's by God's design. Her differences in the way she approaches things help us as men to see things in a different perspective. We would never see them. And so then when she provides that for us, that helps make us complete. We might expect in God's planning a bride for Adam that the next verse would say that God created Eve. But instead what we get is a story of Adam naming the animals. And we might think, why is this same strange exercise of naming the animals, why is it put right in this section? Well, it's because God was trying to teach a lesson to Adam. But by naming all the animals, Adam discovered that for every animal, there was both male and female. And after a few dozen cases, male and female aardvarks and Mr. and Mrs. Crocodile and Mr. and Mrs. Giraffe, and finally he comes to Z, I guess in the Hebrew language, male and female zebras. And when he gets to the end of this list, he wonders, where's mine? And the forlorn verse says, the man gave names to all the cattle, to the birds of the sky, to every beast of the field, but for Adam there was not found a helper suitable for him. What God is doing by having him name the animals is to create a longing and a gnawing in his heart for a life partner. Naming the animals was actually Adam's premarital counseling session. I've done that before young couples get married. We'll sit down and we'll talk about certain things they need to know about the marriage relationship. Well, God provided that for Adam by having him name the animals. And so he found out when he named the animals that nothing in the animal kingdom was a suitable counterpart for Adam. That there was nothing compatible to him, no partner, no counterpart, none was like him. And I know sometimes people say a dog is a man's best friend. But I want to tell you one thing about a dog. He can't do what the woman can do. The woman can provide companionship for the man. Only the woman can do that. And so after naming all of the animals, Adam concludes that in all creation, he alone is alone. He had no one to talk to, no one to laugh with, no one to taste ripe peaches with him, no one to walk in the garden with him side by side, no one to love. There was no one there for Adam. And so God planned a bride. But secondly, we see that God provided a bride. And so in verse 21 it says, so the Lord caused the man to fall into a deep sleep. While he was sleeping, he took one of man's ribs and then closed up the place with the flesh. And so in reality, God is really the first anesthesiologist, and God is the first surgeon. God takes his divine scalpel, as it were, and he cuts open Adam, and then he closes up the flesh where he did the surgery. And notice this happened while Adam slept. That means Adam had nothing to do with it other than supplying the raw materials. God didn't ask Adam for some input or to place an order. I'd like her just a little over 5'8" and dark hair and brown eyes and all of that. No, God created the woman while Adam was asleep, which teaches us men that God doesn't need our help in designing a wife that's suitable for us. And so we go on in verse 22, and it says, then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man. And so the idea made or fashioned is used there literally. The word means built. And the verb pictures God as a sculptor, carefully and deliberately shaping the woman into a creature that would meet Adam's need. And so the Creator created with the material from man. And remember in chapter 1 and verse 27, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And so she has the same characteristics of self-consciousness, cognition, spirituality, personality, relationship, motion, all the image that God gave to man, he also gives to the woman. The only difference is that God made Adam out of the dirt, and he made Eve out of Adam. And so God fashioned the most beautiful of all his creatures, all the loveliness and the beauty and the grace a man could ever imagine, he saw in his wife Eve. And so thirdly, we see that God presented a bride to Adam. Verse 22, if you'll read it very carefully, says that Adam, and I think sometimes we get this idea when we're thinking about the marriage relationship, that Adam woke up and he found Eve lying beside him. That's not what verse 22 says. Read with me in verse 22. It says, and he brought her to the man. And so just picture Adam here. He wakes up and he's wondering what this funny feeling is in his side. And God brings the woman to the man, and he brings her in all of her perfection. And Adam sees them coming, and he sees Eve for the very first time. In verse 23, we have the first recorded words of the man. And Adam said, this is now bone of my bones. And literally the Hebrew says, here now, or it has the idea of this at last. That's in the English Standard Version and the Revised Standard Version, or this one at last in another translation. Kyle and Delitzsch, the commentators from the last century, German scholars, say that it's expressive of joyous astonishment. And Erdsman says this is the very thing that hits the mark. This reaches what was desired. And so when you take all of these definitions we've looked at, what it comes out to, Adam says, wow, this is it. This is what I've been looking for. I named all these animals, didn't find anybody in there, but Lord, she's the one. Thank you, Lord. And she's so much like me. She's not like all these other creatures. She's the one I wanted. And so Adam, excuse the pun here, is now beside himself. That's a pun. Remember, Adam had been looking through all the animals for one corresponding to him, and he came up empty. And when God brought Eve to Adam, he shouted, yes, she looks like him. He goes down the middle of the list, and he can't connect her with any of the animals he's seen previously. She's not a giraffe. She's not a rabbit. She's not a porcupine. Who or what is she? Well, she's one that looks just like him. In fact, she looks a lot like him, but clearly she's different in many important ways. But his brain says this is it. And you'd have to say this is love at first sight. Adam and Eve fell in love from the very first moment they saw each other. Adam rejoices in God's provision for his need. He doesn't waste any time looking around or seeing if he could get a better deal, not that there were any other choices available at that moment. And by the way, the first marriage was an arranged marriage. It was God arranging the marriage between Adam and Eve. And Adam accepts God's gift right on the spot. The wise man Solomon said, "Let your fountain be blessed, and rejoice in the wife of your youth." In Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 22, he who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor of the Lord. From this story, we learn that God planned the human heart for love, marriage, companionship, home, and children. Genesis 1 and verse 28 says, "Be fruitful and multiply." So God designed that from the very beginning. And so in Adam's initial reaction, there's a mixture of relief and ecstasy and delighted surprise. He said, "This is bone of my bones." In other words, there's a blood relationship. He identifies who she is. She is his family. And now Adam completes naming God's creatures. The name of Adam's wife is woman in the English translation. In the Hebrew, man would be pronounced Ish, and woman would be pronounced Ishshah. And even though they sound very similar, the roots of the two words are totally different. Ish conveys the idea of exercising power, while Ishshah means to be soft. And so that's Adam's first impression about the woman. She was soft. And I think all of us men realize that in our wives, that she's a soft person, not only in her mannerisms, but to touch, she's soft. And in verse 24, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." We talk about, when we study, we'll talk about this commentary. I got this from this commentary. Well, this is Moses' commentary. Adam didn't have a father and mother to leave. What God established in the garden has never changed over the course of man's history. And so this is Moses' commentary about what ought to take place in the marriage relationship. Adam didn't have a father and mother to leave, but ever since Adam and Eve, there's been one to leave the father and mother. So here we see God's design once again. Marriage is defined as one man and one woman leaving and cleaving, becoming one flesh for life. Understand very clearly here, two women do not make a marriage. Neither do two men make a marriage. God doesn't call such a marriage. He calls it in His Word. He calls it a perversion. Any sexual conduct outside of marriage is a violation of God's design. What you have in chapter 2 and verse 25 is an exclusion of homosexuality, fornication, and adultery. All sexual activity is excluded except that which is a marriage between man and woman who have left their parents and covenanted together by making a lifelong bond. That is what God established from the very beginning. Now, I want you to notice that to fulfill our need for companionship in marriage, that there must be at least four things. First of all, companionship requires the marriage to be a primary relationship. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother. The parent-child relationship must be altered before the marriage relationship can be established. The cord's got to be cut. That doesn't mean abandoning your parents or cutting off contact with them, but it does mean, and we need to teach our young people this, it does mean that a person needs enough emotional maturity to break away from the dependence upon his parents as they enter into marriage. And parents need to raise their children with a view to releasing them. It also means that if a couple builds a marriage around their children, that they're going to head for serious problems when it's time for the nest to empty. And it's not helping the children either. And so we need to be careful about that. The woman, it's interesting to me, the woman is not. The man's commanded to leave his father and mother. The woman is not commanded to leave her parents. You know why? Because she simply transfers from one allegiance to one other allegiance of the headship. Where she was once subject to her father, now she trades in for another headship, her husband. The man, though, is told to leave his father and mother because he got a more difficult transition. He, as a child, was dependent upon and submissive to his father and mother. When a man marries, he must go through a radical transformation from a dependent, submissive son to now an independent leader who functions as the head of his home. Secondly, companionship requires that marriage must be a permanent relationship. He shall leave his father and mother and be, some translations say, cleave to his wife or joined to his wife. And that word cleave is interesting. It means to cling to hold to. It means to be glued or welded to something. So when you get married, you're stuck. In Matthew chapter 19 and verse 8, Jesus said to them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. It means being glued together, to be welded together. Some of you men have probably, Don, do you ever weld something together? So you know it's not going to come apart very easily. And that's what marriage is all about. It's to be welded together so no force can tear you apart. Third, companionship requires a marriage to be an exclusive or priority relationship. It says there that he shall be joined to his wife. It doesn't say wives, it says wife. Monogamy is God's design. One man, one woman for life. And you say, well, what about polygamy in the Old Testament times? Well, God tolerated that. But we're finding in Genesis, the book of beginnings, that it was not his original intention. God could have created many wives for Adam, but he didn't. One man, one woman for life. That was God's design. And so that means when we get married, we give up close friendships with other women other than your wife. We give up our freedom to go out with the guys whenever we choose to do that. We now have a new relationship with our wife. She is now our first priority in terms of human relationships. And because people haven't done that, they've gotten into all kinds of problems in their marriages. If young people can't handle that, then they're not mature enough for the demands of marriage. Fourth, companionship requires that marriage be an intimate or a personal relationship. In chapter 2 and verse 24, they shall become one flesh. And I understand that includes the sexual relationship, but I believe it involves much more than that. And the reason I say that is because Paul said that. Listen to 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 16. Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute or a harlot is one with her in body? For it is said, he quotes from Genesis, the two will become one flesh. So Paul says that even when a man has intimacy with a harlot, he becomes one flesh with her. But it is a superficial sense of closeness that means absolutely nothing, because there's not what you have in a marriage relationship. There's a commitment to that relationship. But in a harlot situation, there's no commitment. There's just the intimacy and nothing more. And so apart from a lifelong commitment of marriage, intimacy will never bring the satisfaction that God designed it to bring. So let me say a few comments. The one flesh relationship is a profound fusion of two lives into one, shared life together by mutual consent and by covenant of marriage. It is a complete and permanent giving over of oneself into a new circle of shared existence with one's partner. And so that means you live in such a way. You live in such a way that you learn to accept one another, to listen to each other, to learn from each other, to enjoy each other, to share the depths of your lives with each other. Oneness is something that is developed over time. As we give ourselves to our spouse on every level, out of sheer delight and love that we have for the marriage partner. You know, sometimes you hear newlyweds talking about, and they almost think they have a corner on what it means to be in love with one another. They aren't even in the same ballpark with a couple who have been married for decades, a couple who have gone through the vicissitudes of life together, a couple that have developed a closeness that binds them to one another in a deep commitment. And so young people, I'm so glad they're in love with each other. But there's going to be challenges in the days ahead. And when those vicissitudes of life come upon them, they're going to have to learn how to deal with one another and to encourage one another and to get through those conflicts that come up in every marriage. So we see in chapter 2 in verse 25, it goes on to say, and they were both naked. And so this speaks of the openness between man and woman. Literally, there is nothing to hide is the idea of that word. They have no secrets. They have nothing that they don't share with each other. It is a complete and honest openness. The failure to achieve this kind of openness, I think, lies behind so much of breakdown in marriage today. That there is an utter breakdown of communication. Where a couple sit together and they look at one another and they say nothing to each other. Or they do talk, but it's in such trivialities that there's no depth to their conversations about God and one another, what God expects of their relationship and their relationship with other people. This idea of openness means a readiness to share with one another, a complete freedom of communication. Marriages shrivel and wither and die without this. It goes on to say, and they were both naked, and the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. What that's simply saying is they didn't know that sexual desire could be used for wicked purposes, that it could be perverted and twisted, that they didn't have any wicked thoughts running around in their imaginations. They had no capacity for shame because they didn't know evil existed. It was a shameless love that God gave these two. If they weren't ashamed, then what that means is that they could be relaxed and well-adjusted, that they felt at ease with one another, that there was no strain in their marriage, that they were fully at ease with one another. Can you imagine what they experienced in the very beginning of time? But we know the rest of the story, and I think Don will be getting into this next week in Genesis chapter 3. But the fall came, didn't it? And it's interesting as you trace out Genesis, the book of beginnings, as you trace it out, what's going to happen after the fall is polygamy is going to come on the scene in Genesis chapter 4. And then you have evil thoughts and evil words in Genesis 6 in the days of Noah. And then in Genesis 19, you have adultery. And in Genesis 19 with Sodom and Gomorrah, you have homosexuality. In Genesis 34 with the 12 brothers' sister, Tamar, there's fornication and there's rape. In Genesis chapter 38, there's incest where Jacob goes into his daughter-in-law. And then in Genesis chapter 38, we also have prostitution. And then in Genesis 39, there's seduction where Potiphar's wife seduced Joseph. And so what we're seeing throughout the rest of Genesis is that Satan was not going to just lie down and say, well, this is the way it's going to be from now on. There's going to be happy marriages. No, he went after that relationship of marriage with a vengeance. And we see all of that here in the rest of Genesis. The relationship for man in which he finds his greatest fulfillment, in which righteousness is passed from one generation to another, is in marriage. So Genesis 2, verses 18 through 25, gives us God's design for marriage. And as we hold it before us, we can see the contrast. Why so many marriages are failing today. What we need desperately is to return to the biblical pattern. Here is revealed the secrets for a happy married life, as we look at the things that God tells us in Genesis 2, verses 18 through 25. But unfortunately, Satan brought about the fall of man, and the conflict with sin brought polygamy and wickedness and adultery and homosexuality and fornication and rape and incest and prostitution and seduction. And that's the story, the rest of history of man, as he rejects God's initial will for the happiness of mankind. In the movie Groundhog Day, the main character, Phil, played by Bill Murray, finds himself reliving the same day over and over again. And at first he kind of finds humor in it, but eventually he becomes aggravated at it. He becomes depressed. Everything in life becomes meaningless to him. And so soaking one day, he's at a bar, and he says to the guy next to him, what would you do if you were stuck in one place and every day was exactly the same and nothing you did mattered? And the other man at the bar replied, that about sums it up for me. So he's not finding any real happiness in life. And I wonder how many people today would answer the same way as his companion to Bill Murray at the bar did. We go to work every day. We do the same things with the same people. We see the same results. And deep down, we know that there's got to be more to life than this. And so we ache and we search diligently for the answer to this solution. Groundhog Day, though, ends on a positive note. He falls in love with a woman, and through her suggestion, he uses his terrible situation of the same day being the same over and over, being stuck in the same day. He uses it to improve the lives of everyone around him. He knows exactly that this man's going to get drunk and he's going to die in the gutter. And so he picks him up and he takes him someplace and gives him food. And he's got a bowl of soup next to the guy. And so he takes his bowl of soup and gives it to him too. And he's trying to get him. And so he's hoping that the same thing won't happen to the guy. There's a boy that falls out of the tree every day that he comes back. And so he knows that's going to happen. So he goes there and he catches the boy as he falls out of the tree. And so even though he's trapped in these circumstances of having the same thing happen every day that he relives it, he finally finds purpose and meaning in life. The mundane, the same thing seemingly, has a purpose behind it. And the book of Ecclesiastes teaches that very clearly. So we're looking at the book of Genesis at the very beginning of time. God had a design in all that he did in creation. He did everything to motivate man to obey and serve him for his ultimate benefit. Not only for this life, but for the life which is to come. And so with that perspective in mind, God rescues man from the despair of meaninglessness. He gives us a purpose and a hope of enjoying a satisfying life. And so we look at this in Genesis chapter 2. And yes, it was written about 6,000 years ago. But don't you find the Word of God so amazing in that even though it was written so many centuries and decades and millenniums ago, that it's still relevant to us today? It gives us the answer to everything we need to lead a satisfying and serene and successful life. But it all depends on how we respond to God's command. Ultimately, despite God's gracious dealings, despite his love toward man, in Genesis 3, he rebels against that and experiences a depth of misery because of sin. And we just had that list there that showed the sins that man went into because they did not follow the design that God had made for marriage. Someone has said this, just in closing, a little humorous: the perfect marriage, the partners were handpicked, Adam and Eve. Neither brought up the past. Well, that's true. He didn't have to hear about how her father provided her with everything she wanted when she was at home. He didn't have to hear about all the men she could have married. He didn't have to hear about she didn't have to hear about the way his mother used to cook it. They knew they were made for each other, literally. He's the only one for me and she's the only one for me. They never acted like children, and they knew who came first. And so you can see that Adam and Eve had the perfect marriage. But then when sin came in, that just blew the whole thing out of the water. And from then on, it became misery because people are not following what God intended. Bill?
One more to that, he never had to listen to his mother-in-law.
Listen to his mother-in-law, okay. You have experience with that, huh? Brother Willis, you have something? You have something to say? Okay. Anybody else?
One comment back when we were talking about the creation of woman. And we go through that and it sounds like Adam was lonely and all of this. But this all happened on the sixth day.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So he didn't go for decades.
Go through all of
Yeah.
this. The creation of the beast, of man, the naming of them, and the creation of woman all happened the same.
That's right.
sixth day.
That's exactly right. And then the seventh day he rested. So, Brother Willis brought that out last week. He rested on the seventh day. Anybody else? A lot of our men are gone this morning because Doug had to take his father to the hospital to see his mother, Doug's mother, and Chad's out in Texas. His father passed away, and so the funeral's going to be Tuesday. And so a lot of our men are not here. Did you?
One of the main purposes of marriage is to have children. A lot of people ignore that fact.
Mm-hmm.
God, when he created man and woman, he told them to multiply and replenish the earth. And one of the verses that I think we need to think about a lot, he that findeth a wife findeth a good thing. A lot of people don't take into any consideration what they're doing when they're picking a mate. And that is so foolish.
Mm-hmm.
And we see it every day in the real world, that beauty is one thing. And if you got a beautiful wife and a good wife too, you very lucky, and I'm very lucky. But, you know, a lot of girls, a lot of boys want to pick the most handsome or the most beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times that's the worst pick they can make.
That's exactly right. And here's just a quiet, unassuming young man, you know, and they want the athlete or somebody that's got a lot of smarts or whatever, can work on cars. And sometimes they forget that the inner quality is what they need to be looking at. My mother, Karen was born first, I was born second, and then my mother miscarried between Bruce and myself. 5 years later, she had Bruce, and then she had Gail. And then my grandmother lived up in Michigan, and that was my mother's mother. And so she didn't like to fly, but when she was going to have Rhonda, Granny flew down. And she didn't want it. But I think it was Granny that told my mother that, yes, God said in the very beginning, be fruitful and multiply, but it didn't mean, Gene, you had to do it all by yourself. So she tried to stop that. She didn't want to fly down again. So, but a blessing of a large family. I know when, in the old days when people lived in the country, they had children for two reasons, because they wanted children, but also they helped out on the farm. And everybody joined in together. And Doretha, you can tell us about this. How many were there in children? 10? 10. And her mother ran the farm. Her father wasn't there. And so her mother and the children ran the farm. And you put in a lot of work, didn't you? If you never knew Miss Essie, her mother, you missed a real treat. She was an incredible woman. She was 104? 103 when she passed away. But she was incredible. And I knew Miss Essie. She'd be sitting right back there where Denville is. And one time I was talking to somebody else, and I didn't say hi to her. And she was mad at me. She wouldn't even talk to me. And so I learned from then on, you better tell Miss Essie hi. And but she could be strict, couldn't she? She was loving, but she could be strict. And Deborah, if you've ever had one of Deborah's cakes, Doretha's daughter, she knows how to make a cake, and Miss Essie, I guess, taught her how to do that. So, and I've been the recipient of those cakes and thoroughly enjoyed them. Anybody else? Denville, you have anything?
Well, just that, the whole story is just so amazing that God doesn't skip a beat, doesn't miss anything. I mean, the council of Adam with name I never saw it before, and that is really amazing that he did all the animals that. And he found out that he was left alone. It's just so human.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's such a wonderful story that can help us. And a lot of people go to marriage counseling. I understand. I'm not against that. But the best marriage counseling is in the Word of God. And if we'd follow that, we'd be okay. So thank you for your time. Thank you.